It started with a sealed document carried through a private Windsor corridor just after dusk, a document no outsider was ever meant to see. But when Prince William emerged from that closed-door meeting beside royal legal advisors, the atmosphere inside the palace shifted instantly. Staff stopped talking, security tightened, and somewhere behind the carved oak doors, Queen Camilla's inner circle reportedly realized the future of one of the Queen's most treasured private estates had just changed forever. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What began as a quiet legal proceeding soon spiraled into one of the most explosive inheritance storms the monarchy had allegedly faced since the final years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign. Reports suggest William had been urgently summoned after confidential concerns emerged surrounding the long-term security of one of the late Queen's most protected private holdings, a sprawling estate whispered about for years within royal administrative circles as part of the monarchy's untouchable legacy network. The timing alone sent shockwaves through palace corridors. King Charles III was already battling ongoing health concerns, senior aides were stretched thin behind the scenes, and insiders claimed tensions between the old guard of the monarchy and Queen Camilla's extended family had quietly intensified for months before the meeting ever took place. According to various interpretations circulating among royal commentators, the atmosphere inside Windsor had become increasingly strained as discussions surrounding inheritance, property stewardship, and future royal authority slowly moved from private speculation into active planning. Then came the sealed paperwork. Palace administrative streams, ranging from legal whispers to internal scheduling leaks, allegedly revealed that a confidential transfer structure had already been drafted long before William entered the room that evening. Some insiders believe Queen Elizabeth herself may have quietly anticipated this exact conflict years earlier, constructing layers of legal protections designed to ensure that certain royal estates could never drift beyond the direct line of succession, regardless of future marriages, alliances, or political pressures inside the House of Windsor. And when William reportedly reviewed those documents beside trusted legal advisors, the reality of what had been prepared became impossible to ignore. This was not simply a family inheritance, it was a defensive maneuver. A calculated act of preservation designed to protect what many within the monarchy still describe as the sacred geography of the British Crown. Sources close to palace operations claim even senior aides were instructed to avoid discussing the matter openly, an extraordinary level of secrecy for a transfer involving such a historically significant property. The silence itself became suspicious. Courtiers who normally traded endless gossip reportedly stopped speaking about the estate altogether. Meetings were quietly rearranged, guest lists shifted. Certain conversations abruptly ended whenever William's name entered the room. And perhaps most telling of all, Camilla's family allegedly appeared blindsided by the speed and finality of the decision. Reports suggest some within her inner circle had privately believed influence over portions of the estate might eventually expand through proximity to the king, especially after years of careful integration into royal life following the sun-drenched coronation of 2023. But the reality unfolding behind Windsor's ancient walls appeared far colder than anyone expected. Because as William and Princess Catherine continued attending tense private meetings regarding the estate's future, whispers began spreading that this transfer was not merely about inheritance at all. It was about fortifying the monarchy itself against future instability. And according to those familiar with the duchi's unforgiving internal culture, the deeper William looked into the estate's hidden history, the clearer it became that this was never simply about land, it was about control, legacy, and the survival of the monarchy itself. Long before the current royal tensions erupted behind palace walls, the estate at the center of this storm was considered one of the most protected sanctuaries within the sacred geography of the British monarchy. Hidden behind centuries of royal tradition, sprawling acres and carefully guarded legal structures, the property represented far more than wealth. To Queen Elizabeth II, it reportedly symbolized continuity, bloodline, and the future survival of the crown beyond temporary family alliances. That belief, according to royal historians and palace insiders alike, shaped nearly every quiet decision surrounding the estate for decades before the public even knew a struggle existed. Reports suggest the late Queen viewed certain royal properties not as personal possessions, but as living pillars of the institution itself, sacred strongholds, meant to survive political turbulence, changing public moods, and even family conflict. The estate at the center of this controversy allegedly occupied a particularly sensitive place within that philosophy. Its origins stretched deep into royal inheritance frameworks dating back generations, woven carefully into confidential succession, planning long before King Charles III ever ascended the throne. Different interpretations of old palace records describe layers of legal protections surrounding the property, many of them designed specifically to prevent fragmentation or outside influence during moments of royal vulnerability. And perhaps most revealing of all, insiders whisper that Queen Elizabeth became increasingly protective of these arrangements during the later years of her reign, particularly as internal family tensions grew more visible behind closed doors. To traditionalists within the monarchy, Prince William was always viewed as the natural long-term guardian of estates like this one, not because of popularity, and not simply because he was heir to the throne, but because many inside the old guard reportedly believed he understood the deeper burden attached to royal inheritance. Sources close to former palace staff claim William spent years quietly studying how the monarchy protected its assets through legal covenants, trusts, and ancient succession mechanisms that most outsiders never even hear about. The estate itself was allegedly discussed in the same breath as Balmoral and Sandringham untouchable sanctums tied directly to the survival of the crown, rather than the comfort of individual family members. And according to several royal commentators, Queen Elizabeth privately feared what could happen if those lines between institution and personal influence ever became blurred. That fear reportedly intensified during the monarchy's increasingly fragile modern era, where loyalty, marriage, public image and legacy all became tangled together in dangerous ways. Palace administrative streams suggest the late Queen worried less about immediate scandal and more about gradual erosion, the slow expansion of unofficial influence into spaces traditionally reserved for direct royal bloodlines and future sovereign authority. It is now whispered in the highest echelons of royal circles that these anxieties may have quietly shaped inheritance strategies years before the current crisis exploded into motion. At the same time, reports suggest members of Queen Camilla's extended family gradually believed their growing proximity to the crown could eventually strengthen their long-term standing within royal life. Invitations became more frequent, access widened, familiarity with senior staff allegedly deepened. To some observers, it looked harmless. To others inside the institution, however, it reportedly triggered quiet alarm. Because within the unforgiving culture of the monarchy, proximity can easily evolve into expectation, and expectation can evolve into perceived entitlement. As King Charles battled ongoing health concerns and palace tensions quietly intensified, those underlying fears allegedly resurfaced with devastating urgency. And according to palace administrative whispers, those quiet ambitions may have triggered the very countermeasure that ultimately locked them out completely. Reports suggest the tension did not erupt overnight. For months, perhaps even years, senior royal staff had allegedly monitored subtle attempts to reposition influence around the estate's future. Invitations expanded. Private gatherings increased. Certain names began appearing more frequently in conversations once reserved only for blood heirs, and inside the old guard of the monarchy, alarm bells reportedly began ringing over what some insiders described as an unspoken struggle for permanent royal legitimacy. What made the situation especially unsettling, according to palace administrative whispers, was not any single dramatic confrontation, but the gradual shift in atmosphere surrounding the estate itself. Long-time aides reportedly began noticing changes in how discussions about the property were handled behind closed doors. Individuals once considered distant from the monarchy's most protected inheritance structures allegedly started appearing in sensitive social environments tied to royal planning and long-term stewardship conversations. To outsiders, these moments may have looked insignificant, But within the deeply coded culture of the House of Windsor, even symbolic access carries enormous meaning. And according to sources familiar with internal palace operations, that symbolism did not go unnoticed by those who had spent decades defending the monarchy's rigid hierarchy. Reports suggest Camilla's extended family became increasingly visible within royal circles during this period, attending more gatherings, appearing more frequently near senior household figures, and slowly integrating into spaces that traditionalists reportedly believed should remain carefully guarded. Some palace insiders insist these developments were entirely innocent, a natural evolution following Camilla's rise to queen consort after years of public resistance and institutional scrutiny. But others allegedly viewed the situation very differently. Within the old guard of the monarchy, there were growing fears that proximity was beginning to blur into influence. And influence, in the eyes of royal traditionalists, has always been one of the crown's most dangerous vulnerabilities. Different interpretations of internal meetings describe a quiet but growing frustration among long-time palace advisors who believed the boundaries between the monarchy's sacred institutional role and private family interests were slowly eroding. According to royal commentators, this concern became especially intense when discussions surrounding the estate's future stewardship allegedly surfaced during ongoing uncertainty surrounding King Charles' health. Suddenly, questions that had once seemed hypothetical became urgent. Who would ultimately control access? Who would shape the estate's future identity? And perhaps most importantly, who would be trusted to protect the legacy attached to it? Reports claim Prince William was quietly briefed on these frustrations long before the legal transfer process accelerated into motion. Palace administrative streams suggest senior advisors viewed him not only as heir to the throne, but as the monarchy's strongest defense against institutional drift during an increasingly unstable era. Those familiar with the duchy's rigid internal traditions reportedly believed William understood something others did not, that royal estates were never simply properties. They were symbols of continuity, authority, and bloodline preservation stretching across generations. And as tensions deepened, Princess Anne allegedly became one of the most forceful voices pushing for the strict protection of hereditary royal assets. Sources close to former staff members describe Anne as deeply skeptical of any arrangement that could dilute the direct line of royal stewardship established under Queen Elizabeth II. To Anne, insiders whisper, preserving the crown meant preserving its foundations first. Yet caught in the centre of this growing storm was King Charles himself. Reports suggest the king struggled privately with the widening divide between loyalty to his wife and duty to the institution he had spent his entire life preparing to inherit. Some insiders describe him as emotionally exhausted, increasingly aware that every decision now carried consequences not just for his reign, but for the monarchy's future survival. And while tensions quietly escalated behind closed doors, few expected Prince William to move so decisively or so fast. The turning point reportedly came during a series of private strategy discussions now whispered about inside royal circles as the beginning of the heirs' accord. Behind heavily guarded meetings involving William, Princess Anne, and trusted legal advisors, a new plan allegedly emerged, one designed to secure the monarchy's most sacred assets before future instability could threaten them. And at the centre of that plan stood one unmistakable conclusion: the estate had to remain firmly within the direct line of succession. According to insiders familiar with the atmosphere surrounding those confidential meetings, the urgency inside the palace had reached a level not seen since the final years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign. What had once been quiet concern was now evolving into deliberate action. Reports suggest Prince William had become increasingly convinced that hesitation itself posed a danger to the crown's long-term stability, particularly while King Charles faced mounting health struggles and internal tensions continued spreading through senior royal circles. Palace administrative whispers describe late-night consultations, legal briefings, and carefully controlled discussions centered on one overriding objective: fortifying the monarchy before uncertainty could weaken its foundations. At William's side throughout this period reportedly stood Princess Anne, whose influence behind the scenes was said to be both formidable and relentless. Royal insiders describe Anne as unyielding during inheritance discussions, particularly whenever the conversation drifted toward emotional compromise rather than institutional preservation. To Anne, according to those familiar with her thinking, royal estates were never sentimental family assets to be negotiated through affection or social harmony. They were defensive pillars of continuity, protected through discipline, sacrifice, and absolute loyalty to the crown above all else. Sources close to former palace advisors claim Anne repeatedly warned that allowing ambiguity around inheritance structures during a period of royal vulnerability could create long-term instability capable of haunting the monarchy for decades. And it was reportedly within that atmosphere that the heirs' accord began taking shape not as a public declaration, but as a silent internal alliance between those determined to preserve Queen Elizabeth's original vision for the future of the institution. Legal experts were allegedly brought in to review estate transfer mechanisms, hereditary protections, and succession contingencies that had quietly existed beneath the surface of royal administration for years. Different interpretations of these consultations suggest extraordinary care was taken to ensure the estate would remain protected regardless of future political pressures, family dynamics, or shifting loyalties within the House of Windsor. Some insiders even claim portions of the framework had been drafted long before Charles became king, with Queen Elizabeth herself quietly anticipating the need for stronger institutional safeguards as the monarchy entered a more unstable modern era. Her presence, though no longer physical, reportedly loomed heavily over every final decision. Palace staff whispered about the power of the absent queen, a lingering influence carried through old letters, legal guidance, and deeply rooted traditions that still shaped the monarchy from beyond the grave. Yet while William and Anne focused on securing the estate's future, the emotional pressure surrounding the situation reportedly intensified behind closed doors. Sources suggest Princess Catherine became one of William's strongest private supporters during the escalating palace tensions, encouraging him to remain focused on duty rather than public backlash or personal discomfort. Royal commentators claim Catherine understood the deeper stakes involved better than most outsiders realized. She allegedly viewed the conflict not as a struggle over privilege, but as a battle over continuity itself, a fight to ensure the monarchy's foundations remained stable during one of the most uncertain periods in modern royal history. Gradually, the transfer stopped being discussed internally as a family matter altogether. Instead, it was framed as an act of institutional survival, preserving duty over personal loyalties, bloodline over proximity, and legacy over emotion. And once the legal machinery finally moved into place, the fallout inside Camilla's circle was said to be immediate and deeply personal. By the time news of William's new ownership position quietly spread through elite royal circles, the atmosphere inside certain palace corridors had reportedly turned icy. Courtiers stopped speculating and started choosing sides. Invitations shifted. Long-standing assumptions collapsed overnight, and according to multiple royal commentators, Camilla's family allegedly realized they had lost far more than symbolic influence. They had lost proximity to one of the monarchy's most powerful future strongholds. What made the fallout especially explosive, insiders claim, was the speed with which the transfer altered the balance of power inside the House of Windsor. Only weeks earlier, many within elite royal circles had reportedly assumed the estate's future would remain ambiguous for years, particularly given King Charles's ongoing health struggles and the increasingly delicate dynamics surrounding the Queen Consort's position within the monarchy. But once the legal framework was finalized under what palace administrative streams describe as extraordinary secrecy, uncertainty vanished almost instantly. The message became painfully clear. Prince William was no longer simply preparing for the future. He was actively securing it. Reports suggest members of Camilla's inner circle felt deeply humiliated by the outcome, especially after years spent gradually building influence and familiarity around senior palace operations. According to various interpretations circulating among royal commentators, some allies of the Queen Consort allegedly believed their proximity to the king had positioned them for greater long-term access within the monarchy's evolving structure. Instead, the transfer reportedly slammed that possibility shut with devastating finality. One palace insider described the atmosphere afterward as a form of silent exile, where conversations suddenly cooled, assumptions disappeared, and old social certainties dissolved almost overnight. Invitations that once seemed routine allegedly became selective. Access narrowed, and whispers about the new order reportedly began spreading through aristocratic circles tied closely to the crown. To royal traditionalists, however, the outcome represented something entirely different. Behind closed doors, members of the monarchy's old guard were reportedly celebrating what they viewed as a decisive victory for institutional continuity. Sources close to former palace staff claim there was growing relief among longtime advisors who feared the monarchy had entered a dangerous period where symbolic influence and hereditary authority were beginning to blur together. William's consolidation of the estate reportedly restored what many considered a vital line of separation, not merely between individuals, but between the monarchy as an institution and the complicated emotional loyalties surrounding it. Royal commentators increasingly described the transfer as one of the most significant consolidations of William's future authority since becoming Prince of Wales. And according to insiders familiar with his long-term vision, the estate itself was no longer viewed simply as inherited property. It was becoming part of a broader strategy tied to the future modernization and stabilization of the crown. Unlike previous generations, William reportedly understood that the monarchy could no longer rely solely on tradition to survive public scrutiny and internal instability. It needed structure, discipline, clear institutional boundaries, and above all, it needed strongholds that remained unquestionably tied to the direct royal line. Yet even as William's authority quietly strengthened behind the scenes, the emotional toll inside the palace allegedly deepened. Reports suggest King Charles became increasingly exhausted by the widening tensions consuming those closest to him. Sources claim the king desperately hoped the matter would remain private, fearing public exposure could damage not only family relationships, but confidence in the monarchy itself during one of the most fragile periods of his reign. Palace staff were reportedly instructed to maintain absolute silence regarding inheritance specifics, with senior aides allegedly warning that even minor leaks could trigger media chaos and further deepen existing divisions. Still, silence could not erase what had already changed. Because within the walls of Windsor, everyone reportedly understood the deeper truth now taking shape. William had secured more than an estate. He had secured leverage, authority, and symbolic control over a critical piece of the monarchy's future. But even as the dust began settling behind palace walls, one final question continued haunting everyone involved. Was this only the beginning of William's larger royal consolidation? While Prince William stood publicly at the centre of the estate storm, insiders quietly pointed toward another figure whose influence may have been just as critical behind the scenes. Throughout the tense negotiations and mounting family friction, Princess Catherine reportedly remained calm, disciplined, and deeply focused on protecting the monarchy's long-term stability. And according to those familiar with palace dynamics, her quiet support may have strengthened William's resolve during the most difficult moments of the crisis. At a time when emotions inside the royal household were reportedly becoming increasingly volatile, Catherine's composure allegedly stood in sharp contrast to the tension surrounding her. Palace insiders claim she understood early on that the inheritance battle threatened to become far more dangerous than a private disagreement over property. Behind the legal arguments and whispered frustrations, there was a growing fear that the monarchy itself could emerge fractured if personal loyalties overwhelmed institutional discipline. Reports suggest Catherine quietly encouraged William to remain focused not on winning a family conflict, but on protecting continuity for the next generation of the crown. Those close to palace operations describe her approach as careful, restrained, and deeply strategic. Rather than fueling division, she allegedly worked to maintain stability around William, while internal pressure intensified from every direction. Royal staff reportedly admired the way she handled growing media speculation during this period, particularly as rumors surrounding the estate transfer slowly began leaking into elite social circles. While commentators speculated endlessly about fractures inside the royal family, Catherine remained publicly composed, refusing to feed the drama consuming palace corridors behind closed doors. According to several insiders, that restraint became one of her greatest strengths. Different interpretations from former palace aides suggest Catherine increasingly reminded senior figures of Queen Elizabeth II during the late years of her reign, not because of status or authority, but because of her disciplined understanding of silence, timing, and institutional responsibility. Like the late Queen, Catherine reportedly understood that in moments of royal instability, emotional reactions often create deeper damage than the crisis itself. Sources close to the Wales household claim William leaned heavily on Catherine throughout the inheritance discussions, especially during periods when tensions with Camilla's allies reportedly became emotionally exhausting. Some insiders even whisper that Catherine became one of the few people capable of calming William during the most difficult stages of the conflict, urging him to think beyond immediate frustrations and focus instead on the monarchy's long-term future. That influence allegedly strengthened the growing perception among palace traditionalists that the Wales household represented the institution's safest path forward. Over time, the contrast inside royal circles reportedly became impossible to ignore. While other factions appeared consumed by questions of access, status, and influence, William and Catherine increasingly projected discipline, restraint, and continuity. Sources suggest this shift deeply frustrated certain allies of Queen Camilla, particularly as Catherine's popularity among palace traditionalists continued growing behind the scenes. To many within the old guard, Catherine represented a return to the monarchy's older values: duty over spectacle, stability over ambition, and quiet endurance over public confrontation. Royal commentators began describing the future Wales household not simply as the next royal generation, but as the monarchy's emerging centre of gravity during one of its most uncertain modern chapters. And yet, despite the growing confidence surrounding William and Catherine's position, the emotional cost of the inheritance battle reportedly lingered heavily inside the family itself, because behind the carefully maintained public silence, relationships had allegedly been strained in ways that could not easily be repaired. Trust had weakened. Old resentments had resurfaced. And as the palace attempted to move forward from the estate controversy, many insiders quietly feared the conflict had exposed wounds inside the House of Windsor far deeper than anyone was willing to admit publicly. Yet even with William's position secured, the emotional scars left behind inside the royal family were far from healed. At the heart of the entire conflict stood a visibly weary King Charles III, a monarch reportedly torn between personal loyalty and institutional obligation. As pressure mounted around the estate transfer, insiders claimed Charles faced one of the most emotionally painful balancing acts of his reign: protect his wife's interests, or preserve the centuries-old inheritance structure designed to safeguard the crown itself. And according to various palace whispers, the final choice came with enormous private heartbreak. Reports suggest the king spent months struggling with the widening divide between Prince William and the increasingly isolated circles surrounding Queen Camilla. What once appeared to outsiders as manageable family tension had reportedly evolved into something far more dangerous behind palace walls. Senior advisors allegedly warned Charles that hesitation could weaken the monarchy during one of its most fragile modern chapters, particularly while public attention remained fixed on his ongoing health concerns. Yet for Charles, the situation was never simply political. It was deeply personal. Sources familiar with palace dynamics claim the king found himself trapped between two worlds: his lifelong duty to preserve the institution he had waited decades to lead, and his loyalty to the woman who had stood beside him through years of public scrutiny, scandal, and eventual acceptance. Royal historians have long noted Charles's emotional attachment to the preservation of core royal estates, particularly those tied to Queen Elizabeth II's legacy, and the future continuity of the crown. And according to insiders, that commitment ultimately shaped the difficult conversations that followed behind closed doors. Private meetings between Charles and William were reportedly serious, respectful, and emotionally charged, with both men fully aware that the decisions being made would shape the monarchy long after the current generation was gone. Sources claim Princess Anne played a critical role during this period, repeatedly reminding the king of the inheritance principles, quietly established during Queen Elizabeth's reign, principles designed to protect the monarchy from instability, blurred loyalties, and future internal fractures. Gradually, the estate transfer stopped being framed as a family dispute at all. Instead, it became an institutional decision rooted in continuity, preservation, and survival. And in the end, the battle over the Queen's private estate became something much larger than a disagreement hidden behind palace gates. It became a defining moment in the silent transfer of royal power from one generation to the next. Prince William's rise was no longer symbolic. It had become operational, visible, and impossible to ignore. Reports suggest many within elite royal circles now view William as the future guardian of the monarchy's most sacred institutions, while the estate transfer itself has quietly become a symbolic victory for the palace's duty-first faction. Meanwhile, Camilla's family allegedly emerged from the conflict politically weakened, their influence diminished within the rigid hierarchy of the crown. Yet even as power shifted behind closed doors, the shadow of Queen Elizabeth II reportedly continued guiding the monarchy from beyond the grave through old traditions, legal structures, and carefully protected inheritance strategies. And standing beside William throughout it all was Catherine, increasingly viewed by palace insiders as the calm and stabilizing future face of the monarchy during a colder, more disciplined royal era focused on preservation above sentiment. Because inside the House of Windsor, power is never simply inherited, it is protected, defended, and quietly reclaimed long before the world ever notices. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.